So start recording. Okay, so we're back with another Ask the Expert. This time it's on the filibuster. And we have with us today Dr. Molly Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings. She studies Congress with an emphasis on how congressional rules and procedure affect domestic policy outcomes. So welcome, Dr. Reynolds.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so before we talk about the filibuster, I do want to ask some sort of a separate question because I think lots of students might be interested in hearing about this. So you work at the Brookings Institution, which is a DC think tank. So what is a think tank?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that people ask me a lot. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about it. So think tanks are nonprofit policy research organizations that produce and promote analysis and expertise in order to be influential with policymakers. So when I say policy research, I mean that we're trying, our focus is on kind of public policy questions, broadly defined. When I say that we are producing and promoting research, that doesn't just involve writing it. It also involves trying to figure out how to get it out there in the world. So we have, a communications team who works with us to do that. When I say analysis and expertise, I mean both the possible effects of potential policy changes, suggestions about which policies might solve particular problems, and also just generally trying to be a source of credible information in policy debates. And then policymakers are our primary audience, but educating the public is a really important part of this, especially because some of what we do is to try to get people to pay attention to issues that they're not already paying attention to.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I found reports that Brookings has done have been very useful in my research, especially for teaching too, I think. So,
absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of, like I said, what we try and do.
Yeah. So all right, so we'll jump right in and then we'll talk about the Senate and the filibuster. So if I asked 100 people, tell me something about the Senate, I think the most common response would be the filibuster. If I asked them to explain the filibuster, they would probably say when someone talks a long time, like the image behind me here, Mr. Smith giving his filibuster in the movie. That's not really what goes on now with filibusters, right? So you tell us a little bit. So what is a filibuster? Could you give me an example? And sort of follow up is, why don't senators have to do the talking filibuster now?
Sure. So kind of at the highest level, to filibuster a measure in the Senate means to use one of any number of tactics to prevent it from coming to a vote. The ability of senators to do this, to filibuster things, comes from the fact that the Senate's rules generally don't put any restrictions on how long the Senate can debate a particular measure. There's also generally nothing in the Senate rules that allows for only a simple majority of senators to decide to stop debating something and take a vote on it. So yes, one way to filibuster a measure is for an individual senator to go to the floor, to get recognized to talk about a bill, and to just keep talking until either the bill to which he or she objects gets pulled from the floor, or he or she gets something else that he or she wants in exchange. So an example, we don't see this kind of extended speech making too much anymore. We do occasionally. In 2016, for example, Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat of Connecticut, spent about 15 hours on the Senate floor holding up business until Republican leaders agreed to hold several votes on gun control issues. That's what he wanted in exchange for his filibuster. But most contemporary filibusters don't actually involve that kind of speechifying. Rather, they involve one or more senators simply threatening to drag out debate indefinitely because they oppose a bill or because they want to get something else in exchange. And this forces their colleagues to file what's called a cloture motion. So a cloture motion is the tool available to the Senate to cut off debate and actually take a vote on something, but it needs 60 votes to pass. So in June, for example, when Senate Republicans wanted to bring their police reform bill to the floor, Democrats generally opposed it, so it couldn't get those 60 votes needed to end debate. So in our contemporary parlance, we'd say that Democrats filibustered that police reform bill. Why did the Senate shift to a system where it takes 60 votes to get most things done, but where people don't generally actually have to talk the whole time? There are a few reasons. So one, the Senate's workload over time has gotten more intense. There's more work to do, there's more policy problems to solve. In the middle part of the 20th century, the expansion of airplane travel meant that senators wanted to return to their home states more often. And the increased need for fundraising meant that senators have things they need or want to spend time on that are off the Senate floor. So the time cost of actually letting a senator tie up lots of time on the floor has gone up over time. In the mid-70s, Senate leaders tried to deal with these issues by letting more than one bill be pending on the Senate floor at a time. So if a senator wanted to obstruct something, the Senate could temporarily set it aside and continue on to something else. But that made it easier for individual senators to obstruct because doing so didn't hold up everything. That, in turn, increased the need for Senate leaders to negotiate off the floor rather than let senators consume all the time available for debate. Broader changes in American politics have also increased the incentive of individual senators to engage in obstruction. So as the parties have gotten more polarized, it's become easier to hold a minority party, so currently the Democrats in the Senate, to hold that coalition together against a bill. And changes in the sort of broader interest group and media environments have also given senators more reason to exploit these procedural rights, like the filibuster, to build their reputations.
All right, so it sounds like there's sort of a lot going on. There's been a lot of changes over time. So why should we even care about this filibuster or this 60-vote threshold?
Yeah, so basically, we've gotten to a point in the Senate where almost everything needs 60 votes to pass. And because we have these really polarized parties, it can be hard to build that 60-vote coalition, especially because it's very rare now in American politics to have a majority in the Senate that is big enough to have 60 senators in one party. So we saw it pretty briefly in the later part of 2009 after kind of Democrats' big electoral success in 2008. But even then, when they had this sort of very, very successful election, a Democratic president in the White House, a Democratic majority in the House, there were really only about 6 months. So between the middle of 2009, when the contested election in Minnesota finally gets settled, and the beginning of 2010, when Scott Brown is elected in Massachusetts, a Republican, to replace Ted Kennedy, there's this very narrow window where Democrats have 60 in the Senate, and that's really anomalous. We really don't see that very often, and so because it's rare to have big partisan majorities in the Senate now, you need to work with the other party to get those 60 votes to get most things done, and that's difficult to do.
Right, because I think we see fewer people from both parties sort of crossing the aisle to vote with the other side, whereas we probably saw more of that if we look over a broader U.S. history.
Absolutely, and again, now that the parties are farther apart, that they're more polarized, it can be more difficult to get to 60, and so it's just harder to get things done.
Mm-hmm. So you've touched on a little bit of this in your other answers. Could you talk just a little bit about how the filibuster has changed over time?
Sure. So there's really, unfortunately, there's no perfect way to measure the frequency with which the filibuster has been used over time. Senators aren't required to sort of formally register their objection to ending debate until this cloture motion that I mentioned actually comes up for a vote. And sometimes if Senate leaders know that 41 senators plan to oppose something, they often choose not to sort of schedule it at all. But if we use the number of cloture motions as kind of our best available measure of the number of filibusters, we can see that over the later part of the 20th century and the 21st century so far, that it's increased significantly. So now, again, we talk about how basically everything needs 60 votes to pass in the Senate. One particular area where we've seen an increase in filibusters over time is in the context of judicial nominees. So attempted filibusters of federal trial court judges, for example, were virtually unheard of until the late 2000s. So that's just one example of a particular area where we've seen the filibuster really increase over time.
And we've seen too, I think, some cases, and we'll get into this a little bit more, the 60-vote threshold was taken away, right? But you can still slow down the process, mostly thinking about judicial nominees, correct?
And so you can still sort of consume time on the floor when a judicial nominee is up for confirmation, and you can generally also try to, if you're opposed to a particular nomination, you can try to oppose that nominating committee. You can try to get a couple members of the other party to kind of come along with you. We've seen that actually happen a couple of times in the past several years. But generally, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a minute, it's gotten actually, because of some rules changes, it's actually gotten easier to confirm federal judges in the last decade or so.
So is there a way around the filibuster, right? We hear about procedural tricks, but there's rarely tricks in the Senate, but there's rules.
Yeah.
Right?
So basically, yeah. So senators really have two options when they seek to vote on a measure on the Senate floor. So most often, actually, the majority leader, so currently Senator Mitch McConnell, seeks what we call unanimous consent, where he asks if any of the 100 senators object to ending debate and moving to a vote. So if no objection is heard, the Senate proceeds to a vote. If the majority leader can't get all 100 senators to agree, he typically files a cloture motion, which, as I said, requires 60 votes to adopt. If fewer than 60 senators support cloture, that's again when we say a measure's been filibustered. Much of the Senate's business now requires filing these cloture motions, but there are some important exceptions. So one, as we were just talking about, involves nominations to executive branch positions, so cabinet departments, and to federal judgeships. And on those, thanks to two procedural changes, one adopted in 2013 and one adopted in 2017, only a simple majority is required to end debate. So if you want to confirm a federal judge, including to the Supreme Court now, you only need 51 votes to cut off debate and move to confirmation. A second way that the Senate sometimes gets around the filibuster is that there are a handful of very specific types of legislation for which Congress has previously written special procedures that limit the amount of time for debate. Because there is a specified amount of time for debate, which says this is the number of hours that we're going to debate this particular kind of bill, you don't need to use cloture. And so you don't need to get to 60. Probably the best known one of these, and the most, to my mind, consequential, are some special budget rules that I known as a budget reconciliation process. These allow a simple majority to adopt certain budget-related pieces of legislation. Notably, in recent years, this is how the 2017 tax bill was passed to get around the possibility of a filibuster.
So just in broad terms, if the legislation is about money in some fashion, you might be able to use the budget reconciliation.
Yeah, that's a pretty, it's a pretty good summary. So if it's about taxes, or if it's about certain types of spending, so what we call entitlement spending, so things like Medicare and Medicaid, farm price supports, that sort of thing. So it's pretty, a pretty expansive tool. It's not an unlimited tool, and it's become increasingly important to the parties over time as it's been harder to get things done with the 60 vote threshold to try and figure out how to fit their policy priorities into this particular procedural box in order to enact things they want to see done.
Okay, so there's some talk, if the Democrats take the Senate back and the presidency, they're going to do away with the filibuster entirely. What are the consequences of that action?
Sure. So it would certainly make it easier to get a fair number of things done. Again, we've certainly seen that with the decision to reduce the number of votes needed to end debate to confirm executive branch nominees and judges. During the portion of the Obama administration, for example, after the Senate changed those rules for confirming lower court judges, judges were confirmed more often and more quickly. But importantly, to stick with this example about judges, those post-rule change nominees during the Obama administration weren't actually more liberal than Obama's earlier nominees. And so this reminds us that even if we were to get rid of the filibuster, there may be things that don't happen because the majority party, again, the Democrats in this hypothetical, don't actually agree on them. And if we look back to 2017, we see a really great example of this with the Republicans. So as I mentioned, there are these special budget rules, and congressional Republicans tried to use them in 2017 to repeal and replace Obamacare. They tried to use the reconciliation process to get rid of that law, which has been a huge, important electoral messaging point for Republicans since it was passed in 2010, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't actually agree on what they wanted to do. They couldn't come up with a plan that 50 Republican senators would all agree to. So even if we were to eliminate the filibuster, there are certainly things that I think would be able to be passed that can't be passed now, but it's not, ending the filibuster isn't a replacement for actually getting your party, even just 50 members of your own party, to agree on what you actually want to do.
Yeah, I think what people will forget or aren't thinking forward, that if the Democrats are to take the Senate back, they'll probably have some senators from traditional red states, right? So think you need to get the senator from West Virginia on board, and that might be a hard vote to get on lots and lots of issues.
Yeah, and when people ask me like whether I think a Democratic Senate would get rid of the filibuster in 2021, I always say, okay, maybe, but first I need you to show me what piece of legislation you actually think 50 Republican senators will, or excuse me, 50 Democratic senators will agree on and will think is important enough to get rid of the filibuster to pass. And as you point out, any Democratic majority, if it exists in the Senate in 2021, is going to include, for example, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who is not on progressive end of the party, and so building a coalition in the party for something that they think is important enough to get rid of the filibuster for. It might happen, but it might not.
All right, so I'm going to ask the closing question I ask everyone. If you could wave your political science magic wand and have people know one thing about government, what would that be?
So for me, it would be actually to get rid of the idea that gridlock in Washington is largely the result of a lack of political will, particularly on the part of the president. So Brendan Nyhan, who's a political scientist at Dartmouth, calls this the Green Lantern theory of the presidency, after the comic book superhero who sort of musters his superpowers from willpower alone. So basically it's the notion that if only the president tried harder or did all the right things, he could make Congress cooperate and enact his preferred policies. And it's an understanding of the political process that really minimizes the power of the legislative branch of Congress. It also obscures the degree to which Congress and the president, what they can get done is shaped by institutional constraints like the filibuster, like the veto, and really emphasizes just the personalities of the people involved. And I think this is actually how a lot of people think about American politics, but it really, I think, makes it harder to understand what actually is happening in Washington.
Thanks. I think, so I have a lecture on the median voter theorem. So I hope that point will come across, that you need lots of people to agree to change policy, not just the president. The president doesn't have a legislative magic wand
Right.
that he or she can wave. So Great. So thanks for being here. I think you cleared up some things about the filibuster. I hope the students learned. And all right, so thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right.